Shall we start?
All good, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very proud to present Mr. Colin Rhodes to discuss outsider art.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you all for coming out here on a Friday evening. I'm going to do a bit of a mix, if that's all right, of sort of talking off the top of my head, but also reading some stuff. And I'll explain why. Partly, as I was saying to Sophie earlier, I can talk for anything between about 30 seconds and 4 hours without stopping, off the top of my head. Some of it might make sense, but a lot of it probably won't. But what I wanted to do, besides just plugging this book, is I've just had this book published in the last couple of months, which is billed by Thames and Hudson as a revised edition of a book that came out in 2000. But it's actually almost a completely different book to the one that came out 20 years ago. I'm not just saying that to try and get you to rush away and buy a copy of the new one as well as the old one, but because what this book represents for me is sort of 20 odd years of experiencing the whole sort of field which was very new to me 20 odd years ago when I delivered the first manuscript, but also thinking and of reacting to various different both supporters and detractors of the whole idea of outsider art and so on, because it's, as I'm sure you all know, a field that is and has been fraught almost since the day that it arrived. And I think it's particularly pertinent at the moment because the very term outsider art seems to have been sort of, dare I say, colonised by a number of people within the sort of the mainstream art world in recent years, but colonised specifically to set it up as an Aunt Sally in order to try and then sort of pursue some other kind of usage that they want to make with that. And that might not make a lot of sense now, but hopefully as we go through this and I sort of read some of these things and talk about some of these things, my sort of positioning might hopefully come to make a little bit of sense. Because, again, I should point out right from the beginning that I'm not one of those sort of outsider art devotees who kind of uncritically loves everything that is supposed to be outsider art and damns the whole of the sort of professional art world. I think, that would be a bit silly of me, given that I trained at art school for 3 years and have taught in art schools here in Australia and now in China for the last kind of 30 years. So I think one way or another it might just be a little bit sort of disingenuous of me to pretend that I don't like professional art, because I do. So there's that to begin with. This is not, my take is not a sort of a gushing, this is the only real art, this is the only sort of authentic art that there possibly could be. Not at all. I'm interested in it partly because I like it. I can't see the point of writing about things that I don't like, but also because I think it's important to try and produce a kind of a critical history of this thing. That outsider art is a sort of a field, a genre, whatever you want to call it, which really does have a history now. And having accrued that sort of history, then it can't just be chucked away. It needs to be talked about. It needs to be kind of critically approached. So that's where I'm beginning. What I want to do is read a little bit, it's sort of from a piece of paper here, but it's actually from the beginning of the book, that sets the position that is kind of, I guess, my position around this, and then talk a little bit through what I'm saying, through talking about some of the art that's on the walls here, because what we have here is quite a good mixture of almost sort of different types. things that are coming from different places, and as you can sort of see, look quite different to each other in very many ways, and yet somehow find themselves at various points sort of included in this sort of outsider art brute notion. So here goes the reading bit. So outsider art is the creative visual work produced by a rich and varied group of individuals, like this lot, who do not fit into the official category of professional artist. So there's none of my work. We'll see. I didn't say good professional artist, I just said professional. At its best, it renders visible, powerfully and directly, a kind of psychic elsewhere. It usually arises spontaneously in places that are unlikely locations for art making. Now, I see that as really important. That it's about art that's coming from places where we might not ordinarily expect art to come from. And I should be clear as well here, nowhere in this version of the book is the phrase outsider artist used. I've decided very much over the last 25 years that outsider artist is not a term that is either useful or kind of meaningful in any way. And I think that the original sort of formulation of this idea, and especially the idea of art brut, which I'll come to, is that it's the art that is travelling from somewhere where you wouldn't expect it to have come from, rather than its identity being somehow the result of a particular kind of person who is an outsider. I think the questions of outsiderness and that sort of thing are much kind of broader and much wider than the notion of someone in a particular place being an outsider because they happen to be in a particular place. Whereas the art could be made, two doors down the road and still be outsider art. So it's not about whether it's geographically different or not. The art may or may not be made in a psychiatric hospital. The art may or may not be made in a prison. The art may or may not be made at the top of a mountain somewhere far, far away. The art, it's this kind of, what joins that stuff together is that the art's not being made in places where you'd normally kind of expect to see art that is then going to invade, if you like, the art gallery to be found. So it's these kind of unlikely locations, including, but not exclusively, thinly populated remote areas, the urban homes of psychics. So we've got Madge Gill over here, all the way from Walthamstow. Nice, ordinary Walthamstow person. What have we got? We've got the thinly populated areas. Probably none of those here. Almost all of these people are in places that are definitely not thinly populated. The wards of psychiatric hospitals, and again, some of the work here is not sort of directly out of a psych hospital, but has been made by people who have spent time in psychiatric care and whose work in some way represents their kind of lived reality, their lived kind of psychological reality, and that may be deemed sort of different to that the DCMS deems normal. So Anthony Mannix over here is a good example of that. Nick Blinko, way over at the back there, really detailed kind of pen drawings, are coming in some way out of that kind of that sort of mental health experience, if you like. So it encompasses a wide range of production, as you can see, including drawing, painting, sculpture, photography, installation, outdoor architectural environments. And because the people making these works are almost invariably self-taught as artists and usually don't have access to regular art and constructions material, it's often very much characterised by what I call the ingenuity of its production. That if you don't have the kind of regular art materials are available. Use whatever you've got around you. So, you know, some of these things, a lot of Jungle stuff, for example, Jungle Phillips, you know, it's made on bits of stuff that he's found, you know, because he can't afford canvases and things like that. Some of it, I've seen it almost kind of falling apart in front of my eyes because he's using such crap material. None of this, incidentally. But I have got some dust at home that used to be Jungle Phillips works. Especially bits of chipboard, which are sort of internal chipboard, which he then hangs in his garden through the Adelaide summer and the Adelaide winter, and then flogs to a passerby, and then on the way back with your prized bit of work, it sort of disintegrates in your bag. So it's all good, you know. It's good modernist self-destructive art. So, as a category, outsider art's been defined largely by collectors, dealers, trained professional artists, in other words, not the producers of outsider art, and sometimes psychiatrists, all of whom were interested in creative production that lay beyond even the bohemian or underground scenes that are so familiar in modernist counterculture. They worked to make visible and validate a heterogeneous group of visual creative works they deemed to be of high quality as art, but which had been produced by people not otherwise recognised by the dominant art world as artists, and sometimes not even considering themselves to be artists, which again is a kind of interesting thing. Again, I mean, this is often kind of latched on to saying, oh well, you know, if they don't consider themselves to be artists, then you know you're kind of colonising this stuff that is not supposed to be art. You know, how dare you? But everybody I know who has set off from that position of saying, no, I'm not really an artist. You know, I just do this stuff. When people say to them, no, we think this is art, we think what you're doing is art, this is what artists do usually, they go, no, I am an artist. You know, and it's not about, you know, when people are saying, you know, they don't consider themselves to be artists, it's because the definition of artist that they have in their minds is probably a sort of, you know, at the risk of dissing some of our national press, it's probably kind of Daily Mail, Daily Telegraph sort of definition of what an artist is. And they don't recognise that kind of thing within themselves. When it's put in a different way, that it's actually about creativity, it's actually about, you know, making a statement, then suddenly, you know, being an artist, not some highfalutin kind of thing that's up on a pedestal somewhere or down in a gutter somewhere, it's something that, you know, ordinary people sort of do. So, as an intellectual construction, outsider art belongs to the mid-20th century. The term itself was first used in 1972 by the English academic Roger Cardinal, and it was the title of his foundational history of art brut. And this was a category, I'm sure you know, the category that was invented by the French artist Jean de Buffet around 1945. And Cardinal meant outsider art as an Anglophone equivalent for that French term. Now, outsider art's broader history also belongs to a parallel growth in an interest in homegrown, self-taught and contemporary folk art in the United States during the 20th century. And the European and American streams progressively converged and became entangled after the introduction of this new term, outsider art, in 1972. In the half-century since its introduction, the term outsider art has come to embrace work produced in a much wider range of situations than Cardinal envisaged, and it's commonly used as an umbrella descriptor for an historical field spanning the period from around the mid-19th century to the present. And originally regarded as a Western phenomenon, it's now considered to be international and transcultural in scope. So, again, sort of only maybe two real examples of this here. There are the two images on top of each other in this this kind of bit that abuts the ballpoint pen drawings by a guy called Noviadi Angkasapura, who lives near Jakarta in Indonesia. And again, I mean, 50 years ago, there was no kind of sense that work like this might be coming from a place like Jakarta. Any kind of conversation about art, Indonesian art, would almost certainly have been kind of Balinese folk art and that kind of stuff, and that's as far as anyone goes. And let's not think any more about it. There's also an image that I'm looking straight at, but that most people can't see, which has got a sort of orange background, which is by an artist called Mehrdad Rashidi. Now Rashidi is an Iranian artist. Again, I mean, this work doesn't look like Iranian folk art or this, that, or that. It's a very kind of singular voice that is coming through here. And again, Rashidi is someone who is working almost at a sort of visionary level, but getting on the daily business of making images, of finding images in unlikely things. But as I say, being someone who's not a kind of a Euro American. So we have this kind of this sort of expansion. In fact, the image which is a detail of a painting which appears inside the book, a drawing that appears inside the book. This is actually an African artist who works in Senegal. Is that right? No. Ivory Coast, called Ezekiel Mesu. And again, these things are kind of, they're redolent in some ways of, his kind of African locality. But in terms of the imagery that is coming through, the way he's working, the kinds of materials that are being used, it's very kind of singular. It's sort of coming from his sort of desire to make image without worrying about necessarily what people think about it or whether it's in a particular idiom, but just trying to make images the same. So we have that kind of notion of where it comes from, and the sort of the journey that work like this has taken. I mean, it comes out of I think essentially European interests in work that is coming out of the old kind of closed asylums from the sort of late 19th century and up until the 1940s. But that's not kind of outsider art. That's not art brut. That's a particular kind of aspect of working that is sort of fed into a kind of art brut definition. But which in itself, that sort of interest predates notions of art brut. I think I have to keep coming back to this notion that art brut as a notion really belongs to the mid-century as something that is an idea that is turned into a thing. It really belongs to that post kind of surrealist categorization by Jean Dubuffet. So, you have the surrealists interested in, what they called, the art of the insane or psychopathological arts and other such grand, now hopefully forgotten titles. But at the same time, there's this sort of interest, both in America and in parts of Europe, in what sometimes is called naive art, sometimes called folk art, but a sort of a self-taught art, which is again is not working through a set of a particular kind of traditional idioms. This is not DeBarge teapot art. This is not corn dollies and this kind of thing. This again, a little bit like Rashidi, a little bit like Ankasapura, are things which are kind of folkish, if I can put it that way, and yet are kind of quite singular. They're not part of a particular kind of tradition. So you have this sort of interest in the early 20th century, the painters of the Sacred Heart, which is kind of people like Henri Rousseau, Camille Bombois, these kind of French sort of naive self-taught artists, and in America Sort of an emergence of people like kind of Maurice Hirschfeld, John Cain, who again are from a similar sort of place. But at this point, it's all kind of different streams that are all being picked up by bits of the avant-garde and sort of lauded and talked about and not known about. So it's really only, for better or worse, it's really only in the middle of the 20th century that these various kind of different streams are suddenly starting to sort of be brought together as somehow representative of something that has a similar root, and I think really importantly from someone like Jean de Buffet's perspective, something which he wants to present as a kind of alternative artistic tradition, an alternative history to the the one that we probably all got at school and college when we were being taught art history. The usual kind of march from the Egyptians through the Greeks and the Romans through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and all that lovely 18th century sort of floral stuff, and then the boring 19th century academic stuff, and then the great flowering of all wonderfulness in the hands of Picasso and Matisse and other great men. So, and I say that knowingly, it's it's the tradition. That's the who was that bloke? Gombrich, good old Ernst Gombrich, nice old Ernst, who along with various other people gave us, as students and all the rest of it, the history of art. Dubuffet was kind of, from his perspective, very keen, in a very sort of polemical way, to overturn that sort of stuff and present another set of possibilities, another kind of tradition. Part of that might be seen as him sort of in some way cynically positioning himself for the launch of his own kind of great career finally in the 1940s, having been having a go at it for 20 years before that. And Dubuffet is, he's one of probably less so in this country, especially nowadays, but in France he's kind of top 6 kind of 20th century artists. He's really big. He's blue chip, is Jean Dubuffet. You can't walk in a park in France without bumping into a big Dubuffet concrete sculpture. That's how big he is. It's like here you bump into a Henry Moore. In France, you bump into a Dubuffet. So, again, Dubuffet's, he ain't art brut. But art brut is very much, his kind of construction for presenting this thing that allows him to disavow all of that other stuff that everybody else came from. In a way that's where this stuff begins. It begins out of polemic, and I kind of have this hunch. So it's not really in the book what I'm about to say, because it's a hunch, and obviously I'm a serious academic who doesn't write down hunches. I've got this kind of hunch that because this whole sort of field that I'm trying to talk about this evening came out of polemic, it sort of remained, knowingly or unknowingly, locked in polemic ever since. So when people come up and say, outsider art is the only kind of art, everything else is rubbish, this is stupid, I have the knowledge, I know that this is the only thing to look at, and if you look at any of that other stuff, then you're inauthentic. If that's not polemic, I don't know what it is. By the same token, people grabbing some of this stuff and saying, this is outrageous, these two things that I think are really good are really not outsider art, so I'm going to show them in my gallery, and all these people who talk about outsider art, this is outrageous, you mustn't talk about it at all. It's just the other end of the same kind of polemic. But this is what we see. This is what we see continually. So Dan Miller, who's standing right behind So Dan Miller works out of a supporters studio in Oakland, California, San Francisco, basically. Now his work is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He's collected as much by people who collect contemporary art with a capital C and a capital A as he is by people who collect outsider art, art brut or whatever. And his work fetches, kind of contemporary art with a capital C, capital A prices. Now, Dan Miller is someone who, as I say, works in the supported studio. So he's someone who, on his own, is unable to kind of, get it together to sort of make art and all the rest of it. If the materials are placed in front of him, if the situation is sort of there and ready for art making, he produces these fantastic things. But he can't go to the shop and buy some paper and some paint and all that sort of stuff. This guy is really severely autistic, has very little kind of spoken language. He suffers dreadfully from I can't remember. So pardon my kind of brainstorm here. Epilepsy. So he's prone to fitting almost at any time. So this is a guy who, in the conduct of his ordinary life, has great challenges. In all the best ways of the times that we're living in, and they're not always the best ways, but in this instance, in the best ways of the times we're living in, the people around him, the people who work with him, the people who've seen his desire to make visual art, do everything they can to minimise the disabling aspects of the things that confront his everyday life, so he can get on and do that. And what you end up with is this fantastic stuff. Now, on one level, this is art that's coming from a place where you wouldn't expect art to come from ordinarily. So, in my definition of outsider art, it's kind of outsider art. But that doesn't mean it's not contemporary art with a capital C and a capital A as well. The two things are not necessarily exclusive. But I suppose the point I'm edging towards then is that whereas Dan Miller has been picked up by the capital C, capital A world, a whole bunch of other people whose work I might think is really good, but what do I know? But I might think it's really good, haven't. So we're then in this sort of weird sort of position where, as it often happens with the art world, you end up with this kind of this either or, this sort of this diametric thing where either something is, the real art is the capital C, capital A stuff, or it doesn't really exist. It's the old Douglas Adams thing of when Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent landed in the middle of Lord's cricket ground, and no one noticed their spaceship because it was so unbelievably impossible for a spaceship to have landed in the middle of Lord's cricket ground that nobody saw it. And I think sometimes art in general, let alone outside art, suffers from that. If it's not in the right place, it doesn't exist. It's a bit like when I go to, only occasionally, let me tell you, to some of the more expensive parts of this city. I walk down the street and it's pretty damn clear that I don't exist. It's like someone will come and go, "Oh, there's a force field here, what's wrong? Why can't I get through here?" It's just me, I'll just move out of the way. So Dan Miller, contemporary art, absolutely. But it's also outside of art. Jungle Phillips, he hasn't been picked up by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. His work is not in the National Gallery of Victoria or the South Australian Art Gallery in Adelaide, where he lives. But that doesn't devalue what I'm seeing in this work and what I think is sort of important in this work. So, until people like Jungle and Anthony Mannix are also kind of jostling and sort of being brought into this other fold. I'm quite content to carry on talking about outsider art brut and that kind of thing because it's a way of actually talking. It's a way of giving people visibility who might not otherwise have visibility. And I think, again, it comes back to why I won't talk about outsider artists anymore, because in the vernacular of the present, I find that kind of quite disrespectful. But outsider art, I'm still prepared to talk about, because I'm talking about the art. I'm not talking about the makers in that respect. And as someone who makes art and writes about art, I've always found that knowing something about the context of a piece sort of enriches the well, sometimes it kills it actually, but normally most of the time it kind of enriches your enjoyment of the piece. But I'm sort of, I don't know, old-fashioned enough, probably. I'm starting to feel old suddenly. In my day it was different to this, but it was. I think that sense of when you're faced with a work and it makes an impact and you're interested in it, then that's the single most important thing about that work. Anything else you find out about that work can only add to that impact. It can only enrich. It can only bring sort of detail, I guess, to those things. And I say that partly because when we look at the history of art, capital T and H and A and all that kind of stuff. I'm very into capitals this evening. Sorry about that. It's probably because I'm in the capital. It's there's a lot of art that has become kind of canonical, where we have no idea who made that work, and not necessarily because in some cases it's because whoever collected that stuff in the first place was utterly uninterested in who made that work because they saw it as kind of symbolic of something else. But in so many cases, we just don't know. I mean, the further away you go, the earlier something is made, the more it gets lost. We lose contact with the culture of the person who made that thing. We often lose contact with their names, particularly common in a lot of European medieval art, for example. And yet the work speaks. And it doesn't always, or doesn't even necessarily, speak with the same message and the same language that it did when it was made. And I think this again is something that I think is important for us to think about in general when we're thinking about art, and especially art that was made more than 20 minutes ago, because the stuff in the National Gallery that I love, I can't speak for anyone else, but I go into the National Gallery and see some of the Quattrocento painting and things like that, and I really love so much of that stuff. Now, I'm not getting any of the sort of specific kind of Catholic sort of 15th century Italian stuff that presumably it's about, other than knowing kind of what that context means. Knowing that stuff doesn't help me in what I'm doing, what I'm liking. I'm failing to notice every time I go in there, except when I force myself to, that I'm not in a church, that this panel was actually part of a polyptych, which is now scattered across the rest of Europe somewhere, or the rest of it's lost. The decontextualization in terms of history and all that kind of stuff of this work is immense in so many ways. And yet, these things still speak to me. Now, in art, and the way that art history has been taught for the last 150 years, if not 200 years, has been somehow that to understand art, you have to understand the context. You have to understand the specific desires and meanings that the artist was trying to pour into the work. A very great person that I knew, and I knew much too late in their life to get to know as well as I'd like to, was a person called Phyllis Kind, who's an art dealer out of Chicago and later moved to New York. Now, Phyllis started off as a contemporary art dealer, capital C, capital A, and then also started showing this other stuff, art brut, outsider art, whatever you want to call it, as well as contemporary art, capital C, capital A. One thing Phyllis said to me more than once, which really resonated, was she talked about the intentional fallacy, which to anyone who's ever kind of studied literature will know exactly what I'm talking about. Nobody gets talked to in that sort of way when they're doing art or art history. Now, the whole thing about literature and the big difference between the way we tend to be sort of taught and learn about literature in an academic way to art is this kind of sense that that creative literary production kind of has a life of its own. Whatever the intentionality of the producer, and especially when it comes to poetry, the actual text speaks in a way that is unleashed, if I can put it that way. Which has gone beyond that control. And Phyllis always said, that one of the things she liked about the stuff that was called outsider art that she was working with is that work always seemed to speak in ways that that almost kind of, whether intentionally or unintentionally, but kind of really repulsed that notion of, what's intentionality about here? That these things are they're coming straight at you, they're speaking to you, and they're speaking from some other place to all of us, whatever that place may be. But they're nevertheless speaking kind of loudly and declaratively and sort of potently. And that's what that Quattrocento stuff is also doing to me in the National Gallery. So yeah, from a kind of academic perspective, from a perspective of wanting to know more about where something comes from, it's good to know about all that other stuff. But it's also, I kind of think, interesting to sort of engage with work in a way that is far more like we might engage with a poem, how we might engage with text, in that sense of not that we read it, but that we allow it to communicate with us, with the life that it's kind of carrying and the communication it has with us. It doesn't say that anywhere in any of this stuff, but I'm finding it interesting to think about. And I just think that, when I think about all of the work that is in this gallery here now, that's what it all does to me. And I know a bit about, all of this stuff, where it came from and all the rest of it. Some I know more than others. Some I know the artists who made it, or knew the artists who made it before they passed away. But the basis of all of this stuff is, this is all work which is already kind of speaking eloquently and powerfully before I know more about it. And probably a good example of that is the two black and white drawings on the back there by an artist called Rosemary Coetzee. I've probably got about 20 drawings like that by her, all of which she gave to me after the first edition of this book was published, because I reproduced a couple of her drawings in that book, having never met her. And that wasn't unusual. I mean, she was massively prolific, and she was making these drawings all the time, every day, day in, day out. And she would at times give people who she thought would kind of both appreciate and sort of use those drawings to good end. She would give them those drawings, but always with the proviso and under the kind of promise that you never sold them, you never kind of dispersed them or anything like that. That these were things that, you know, she'd given to you in an almost kind of talismanic way to use. But all of these drawings are part of a kind of, I was going to say never ending, but it did end. It ended when she died in 2007. But it was only with her death that it ended. But this kind of continuing series called I Weave You a Shroud. Now, Coetzee believed, and we're not sure whether she was or not, but Coetzee believed that she'd been in 2 concentration camps at the end of the Second World War. That most of the family had been killed in those camps, and she was a German Jewish woman who'd then ended up growing up with foster parents in Switzerland. But a sort of a trauma, I guess it must have been in her late 30s, something like that, and sort of breakdown. She went from being a quite successful textile artist, who's collected by Peggy Guggenheim and other people, and kind of devoted the rest of her life to this kind of Holocaust memorial. And you know, you see these things, and that when I first saw Rosemary Coetzee, I saw kind of a whole wall of these drawings, and it's a bit like being presented with a Christian Boltanski installation. I don't know if you know those things. If you don't, look for a Christian Boltanski installation. It's powerful stuff. You know, not only does it hit you, but you know straight away that, you know, this is more than just a sort of drawing of people who look like they're sort of crouching. There's people who look like their very existence is threatened, and that actually something really kind of existentially important is going on here. You know, so knowing more about that helps, but that initial, for me again, I can only speak for me, that initial kind of blast of the power of these things is really, really kind of important. How long have I been talking for? 4 hours?
Almost.
40 minutes.
Saturday now.
Saturday, okay. Which Saturday? Okay. I might sort of round up there. The only other thing that I would say before I open it up and invite any kind of questions, but just a couple of things I want to point out. One is there are 3 images here. This one by Purvis Young, this one by Thornton Dial, the Women and the Fish, and that one by Mary Tillman Smith. These are all works that were made by people from the southern states of America. Purvis Young actually lived as an adult in Miami, but his kind of whole aesthetic and all the rest of it was really that kind of the southern black diaspora aesthetic. And Mary Smith and Thornton Dial, both from Alabama. Mary Smith from a fairly rural, fairly remote part of Alabama. Thornton Dial actually was born and grew up and died near Bessemer, Alabama, which is a sort of suburb of Birmingham, as they call it there. But all of these artists were people who kind of first emerged through that lens, you know, the outsider art lens, the contemporary folk art lens, as it's suddenly sometimes called in the States, because their art came from places where the people who sort of are the arbiters of art wouldn't normally expect art to come from. These are self-taught people. These are people who are kind of making art out of both a compulsion to make art, but actually also out of the very real sort of traditions of Black America, and in particular out of the kind of the Congo traditions, which are sort of continue to live and are sort of changed through the times of slavery and so on. So powerful, important stuff. It took a long time for the sort of mainstream art world to kind of catch up with the fact that, you know, these weren't just sort of stuff that was kind of made by old kind of untutored black people in America and all the rest of it. I mention this partly because I think this, not only do I think this is great art, but also there's a show coming up at the Royal Academy that opens in March called Souls Grown Deep, which I think is going to be an unbelievable show. It'd be a real eye-opener, I think, for an awful lot of poems. Because, you know, we'll be seeing, you know, these are my humble little bits. We'll be seeing really great works by Dial, by Lonnie Holly, who's still around and is suddenly a rock star. Again, Purvis, Mary Tillman Smith, whole bunch of people, you know, go to the Royal Academy. This is going to be a great show, and quite rightly in an absolute kind of mainstream museum. In the last sort of 5 or 6 years only, suddenly you can't go into an American museum, big American public museum, without encountering these people now. 6 years ago, I could go to Bill Arnett's warehouse in Atlanta and it was all just stacked up there and nobody wanted it. So there's been a wonderful and thankful sea change for all sorts of reasons. But up until that point, if that candle hadn't been kept burning elsewhere, we wouldn't have this stuff to show. The other thing I wanted to show you is right down there. There's two little images of desert landscapes from Australia. That's the only person I've ever discovered in inverted commas. I've never tried to discover artists, but that's a guy called Chris van der Wettering, who's an old, originally Dutch guy, sailor, who moved to Australia who knows when. He's born in 1937, and I came across him in about 2009, I think. We went on holiday up near Coffs Harbour in northern New South Wales, and it's never really happened to me before or since, but one morning I got up and the garage door of the house opposite the place where we were staying was open, and there's this old guy painting in there. You know, and me being me, I went over and, you know, he was clearly a little bit annoyed that, you know, I was talking to him. It was like this lovely mixture of, like, he couldn't believe someone was sort of talking to him, but he was a bit irritated. And I quickly found out why, because he told me that he was only allowed to paint in the garage because his wife wouldn't let him paint in the house. And he was only able to use the garage when his wife was out using the car to go to the shops. And she was at the supermarket at the moment. And so it was kind of, you know, me talking to him. It was valuable painting time, because as soon as she came back, he had to pack up because the car was more important than his painting. So they're the two small ones that I bought. I did buy two massive ones that are probably twice as big as that framed Dan Miller, which we then had to somehow fit in the car to get home, sort of tied to the roof. So it's a kind of, you know, a classic, thankfully the only classic story of going on holiday with your family and then coming back with paintings tied to the roof that weren't intended. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. I hope some of that's made sense, and I'm happy to answer any questions or have any sort of debate that people want to have, and talk about any of the works that are on here. I suppose I should say, I don't think I did say at the start, that all of this work is stuff I've kind of accumulated over the past 25 years. I don't think I'm a collector, but when you see it looking like this, it starts to look like you are, doesn't it? But it's mostly work that has either come into my possession because I've written about somebody, and it's been a sort of I haven't really got any money. Can I give you some art for the writing? And because I'm such a breadhead, I go, yeah, just give me the art. It's great. It's much better. I'd only spend the money. Couple I bought, and a couple of these things which I've said before that I'm most kind of pleased about is where artists have swapped a piece of their art for a piece of my art. There's nothing nicer than doing that kind of art exchange. So I'll stop there. Thank you. And the book's more incoherent than me talking, and there's some copies out there if you want to buy one.
Did anyone notice that when you were talking about things coming from another place, that the light started to go? Yeah. Yes. Do you remember? Do you remember the ghost, gallery ghost?
I have one.
Yeah.
Do you think when this kind of work is picked up by the more capital C, capital A world, that exploitation of the artist is something either that's more common, something to be looked out for, as these are people who are generally, as you say, unaware of this world, might not be knowledgeable of how this world works? Can be. There's room for exploitation in that world.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And if you've encountered any stories of that, or just any.
Yeah, it's funny. The artwork right in the corner there, in between the Chris van der Vetering and the Rosemary Cots, is by a guy called Selby Warren, another Australian guy from a place called Trunky Creek, which used to be a gold town, but by the time Selby Warren was a young man, was almost a ghost town. But Selby Warren got picked up by I can't remember the dealer's name offhand, but got picked up by a fairly important Sydney dealer in the 70s, and it's kind of interesting thing because it's a sort of slightly sideways bit of an answer to your question, but the work was picked up. The guy had a show of Selby's work. Selby, went to the opening, took his family to the opening, loads of fanfare, there was stuff in the papers and that sort of stuff. Sold out the entire show, at the kind of prices that were agreeable to both him and the dealer, and, more than agreeable to him. And then it sort of went flat, as so often happens for any artist. You have a show and all that kind of stuff, and people have bought your work, and there's a big fuss, and then it goes flat. And you then either have to hope that the next show, when it finally comes a couple of years later or whatever, is also going to be sold out, or that was you're a one-hit wonder. Now that kind of thing was there for Selby Warren. And this is a story which is really about how people who are not kind of trained to be in the art world, as opposed to being trained as artists, trained to be in the art world, don't really understand how all this dealer stuff works. So Selby Warren then spent about the next 5 years harassing the dealer, progressively accusing him of ripping him off and all that sort of stuff, where he'd just been acting like an ordinary dealer. Now, where that is kind of interesting, I think, partly is a sort of a duty of care thing. That if you're going to work with an artist who wasn't trained to be part of the art world, wasn't trained to make it in the art world, which let's face it, that's what we do in art schools, have done for the last 40 years. It's not just about making art. Awful lot of the modules and the talk and all that sort of stuff is about how to be a professional artist, or how to make it in the art world, whichever you like. So part of the answer, I think, is that I think often it's problematical because the people who are kind of picking up these artists don't know how to work with those artists, and sometimes don't care. So that becomes sort of exploitative in some ways. What I think stops that level of exploitation happening often is that quite a few of the artists who sort of get picked up by the contemporary art world, with capital A, capital C, capital A, are already dead. Lot easier then. Yeah, exactly. And to tell you the truth. So it's
Dead.
Dead. So Venice Biennale, for example, in 2013, one of the great sort of things that was trumpeted about that Venice Biennale, that there was a lot of outsider art in it. That the curator had brought all this stuff in, made it part and parcel of the regular Biennale thing. There was no hierarchies and all this kind of stuff. And all the critics said, there's no such thing as outsider art. This shows that it's real art. That it's just all the same. There are no hierarchies. But out of, I think, what did I calculated? Something like 90% of the artists who came from that sort of outsider art kind of field were dead. And most of them have been dead for over 30 years by the time of the 2013. And some have been dead for a lot longer. So it's kind of interesting how, in the same way as Quattrocento painting in the National Gallery might be surprisingly modern to me and speak in all sorts of beautiful ways about great painting and sexuality and when you're nailed to something, I've got arrows in you or whatever. That sense of this stuff by people who Henry Darger, who died in 1972, Martin Ramirez, who died in 1963, Madge Gill, who died in 1966, Scotty Wilson, who died in 1972. This is suddenly contemporary art. Adolf Wolfli, who died in 1935, it's suddenly contemporary art. Now, that's a transformation through the lens of a particular contemporary aesthetic. So in that sense it is, because a curator has made it contemporary. But in terms of, when that stuff was made, no one could work out what to do with Adolf Wolfli other than the surrealists and his psychiatrist, Walter Morgenthaler, in 1930. It's just like, it's kind of, this is weird stuff. This is too weird for us to even look at. Move forward to 2013, it's kind of, wow, this is really contemporary. So this is, I suppose it's an example of, the art communicating, if we can put it that way, in the same way as a poem does. But also, if I want to sort of come at it from another angle, that kind of sense of how a particular aesthetic at a particular moment in history and all the rest of it might suddenly kind of seem to click with a particular moment where, for a long, long time, it didn't click with that moment. So there's that. Finally, on that question, someone like Dan Miller, one of the great things about creative growth, the studio where he works, is they kind of act as agents for their artists. So for very, very many years, the supporter studios were, they were very interested in sort of enabling and facilitating art making and that sort of stuff. But they were not very canny about the art world. So very easy for the artist to get ripped off or treated, in sort of quite desultory, sort of ways. The great thing about creative growth and some of the others, especially nowadays, is that they're very conscious about the way that they're kind of, they have an assumed responsibility to sort of work with the artists to build their careers, and not just for it to be about art making.
That's the same with Richard in the Netherlands, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Now, Paulus de Groot is another example. The nice pink painting of a homo from Schiedam. So all of Paulus's paintings are either images of homosexual men or vampires, because Paulus is a gay man, and that's really nice.
Vampires.
And he really likes vampires as well. Loves horror films. So, but again, I mean, it's sort of, I mean, it's kind of interesting, because Paulus as a man with Down syndrome, in the context of the Herrenplatz, where he works, the Herrenplatz is more than happy and happy to kind of support and encourage him to paint images which are about his sexuality, which are kind of, potentially quite confronting and this kind of thing. Happy for him to do that. Now, there are still plenty of studios that I know around the world where the nice people who run those studios would say, now, we mustn't have imagery like this. What about those lovely flowers you were painting last week? So again, the only reason I mention Paulus's sexuality and the fact that he's Down syndrome is that in the context of the Herrenplatz, it's okay and encouraged for him to actually paint what it is he wants to paint. There are plenty of other places where, and I won't name them, but I could, there are plenty of other places where that sort of thing is sort of curtailed and stopped. It's either by the studios or by the families of the individuals that are concerned. So there was a really nice, I'm not going to name anyone, there's a really nice exhibition of a guy called William Scott, not the hitherto famous British artist from the 1920s, but an American who again works with creative growth, very kind of detailed stuff, lots of images of idealised of people, kind of flying saucer stuff, idealised cities and that kind of thing. But although creative growth is really happy for people to sort of express themselves as they want to, his family, who are very staunch kind of religious people, absolutely curtail any sort of desire and possibility he has for making sexualized images. And the only reason I know this is because on some of the drawings he writes about this stuff. It's like, my sister says that I should not do this sort of stuff, so I'm presenting this lovely image here. And it's like, it's hidden there, it's hidden in plain sight. Anyway.
I was just thinking about William Blake and the way that he's been sort of reassessed over the past few years, and whether there's any correlation between his work and outside of work. William Blake?
Blake.
The sort of visionary side.
Yeah.
I just wondered, because I think he's been reassessed a lot at the moment, and he was described as mad, I think.
It's funny. I mean, it's always kind of dangerous, but also tempting to kind of hypothesize people in different places. But I'll do that anyway. If Blake had been born 100 years later, and conducted himself in the way that he did, I'm pretty sure he would have ended up in a secure hospital, ended up in an asylum. Because the potency and the absolute kind of sureness of the way he kind of spoke and prophesized and talked about visions and things like that. 100 years later, that would not have been seen as okay. In his day, he was just seen as just a little bit more kind of eccentric than some other people. This was a time in London. Peter Ackroyd writes about this absolutely beautifully in his biography of Blake. It was a time when you could walk out in the streets in Southwark or onto the new Regent Street and all that kind of stuff, and see flagellants walking through the street, whipping each other. Swedenborgians talking to angels and this kind of stuff. This was a moment in time when Blake was a bit extreme, but he was only a bit eccentric. 100 years later, he wouldn't be seen as eccentric because by that time, Victorian culture had sort of really nailed that stuff down, and anything like that going on was very much behind closed doors and seen in a sort of a different way. And yet, the beginning of the 20th century, you have this incredible boom in mediumism, spiritualism, where Madge Gill comes from. So, the voices that Madge Gill is hearing, the spirits that Madge Gill is communing with, are not seen in a way that is somehow, kind of psychopathological, but as part of this sort of spiritualist thing. And in the first 20 years or so of the 20th century, in Europe and America, spiritualism was seen as a kind of really part of modernism. It wasn't seen as this old thing. It was people like the Surrealists that sort of, did for surrealism's modernism, did for spiritualism's modernism, by refusing to kind of accept the metaphysical aspect of the spiritualist thing and insisting on the kind of the Freudian, sort of it being about the unconscious and all that kind of stuff, and automatism as opposed to communing with the spirits. But you've got the College of Psychic Studies in Kensington, which is founded by Conan Doyle, who's an absolute believer, and his belief wasn't seen at the time as this kind of extraordinarily weird thing. It wasn't everybody's cup of tea, but not extraordinarily weird, but actually part of his modernism. So, how we, just dissed history previously. Obviously, I'm a historian, aren't I? So, so where something sits in a particular time can sort of change the way, a person is seen, and the kind of context that you sort of exist in. So, there's an artist called Minnie Evans, who I don't have any work of her or here, but she's illustrated in the book. But Minnie Evans, in the context that she grew up in, which was a kind of pretty remote, strongly kind of Southern Baptist environment, in her teens, she started hearing the voice of God. God was talking to her. Now, the reaction of her community was that she was blessed, and that this was God talking through her, and that she was kind of channeling the Spirit. Now, if she'd been in New York City and was walking around the streets going, "Hey, God's talking to me," even at the same time, I think she'd have been met with a different response. So sometimes context is a difference between whether you're seen as kind of as a centrally placed person, or a person who belongs in a certain kind of atmosphere, or someone who needs to be taken out of general circulation and cured. There's a great. It's a really boring read, but it's a great book called Voices of Reason, Voices of Insanity, which is about voice hearing. That a couple of academics at the University of Manchester wrote probably 25 years ago now. But they actually, through the idea of voice hearing, trace the history of that kind of thing. So someone like Aristotle, I guess it must have been, if I remember rightly. Aristotle was killed not because he was a voice hearer, which he was. Aristotle had voices, had auditory hallucinations, as we might say now. But he was killed not because he was a voice hearer, but because the voices he was hearing were enemy voices. So he's like an Athenian, and I can't remember who it was, but he's hearing voices that are from the enemies of the Athenians. So that's what did for him. Not that he was a voice hearer. So just these kind of little sort of things in time can make all the difference about where you sit, where you are, and how you find your way in the world, and then ultimately how your work, if you're an artist, might find its way in the world. All right. Thank you all. No, we still got the light going.
I think on the voices that we can just say thank you very much,
Yeah,
Colin.
thank you all.
Please.
Nice work.